Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Fight Chat Friday from TKD Coach Academy. This week we're looking at the perennial kick, the side kick. It's been popular forever, but its use has changed a little bit over time, and different exponents have highlighted different ways that you can use it. So this week we're going to dig into the side kick. We're going to look over the last 20 years of people using the side kick, and let's hope that there's something that you can take from that one.
Everybody, welcome back to Fight Chat Friday. So in today's sidekick clips, we're going to have a look at how it differs over the kind of like the recent use of sidekick versus maybe the early 2000s and even a little bit before. So we'll be looking at how it's used defensively, we'll be looking at the engagement ranges, how the stance that we use differs and how you can use different sidekicks based on that. Carrying to shoot and score direct long shots with singles, carrying with multiple shots, and kind of like what we call like floaters, so not really kicking to score and things like that. So we're going to look at many different types of sidekicks today, and then we're going to kind of have a look at how they differ over the years and if they differ at all. And maybe some people were a little bit before their time, some people are using it different now. So we'll just have a look at it, have a chat through it, and maybe we'll come up with a little bit of a conclusion at the end. We'll see.
Sure. So maybe a good place to jump off with that is talking of someone who maybe was a little bit before their time with their sidekick. And we'll look at the stance in particular. And our first clip, we're going to have a look, and Richie might take us through this, with Ronnie Goodcup from Netherlands and Daniel Jowell.
Yeah, so in this first one, Ronnie is very much side-facing. So this is 2007, Ronnie in blue, Daniel in red. Daniel usually favoured a more half-facing into almost a full-facing stance.
Yeah.
And I think that obviously impacted the type of sidekick he used, where Ronnie, very much side-facing, lifted a knee really high, and it was almost like that sidekick that we see now. So I think that he was a little bit before his time, to be honest, and it would have been very effective in today's game. Daniel was a bit more... He favoured hands more, really. I think that's fair to say, especially around this time of his career. And the sidekick was just used every now and again, and there's lots of different steps and a different distance he used because of the stance.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, it's a generational thing, but you'd say Ronnie's stance, his guard and so on in particular, were also kind of a throwback to an earlier era. So you'd have definitely seen that in the late 80s and early 90s as well as a common style. But that had gone out of favour in the main, and Ronnie's as such bringing it back at that stage. So it is just interesting how things can be very cyclical. Whereas Daniel had, I suppose, his style had evolved to beat that style, was using far more lateral movement and distance to work around, find angles for turning kicks and for punches. This next clip is from the World Championship final in 2005 in Dortmund. Kieran Ryan there in red against Greece in blue. And starting to see, a long stance, but with a little shifting forwards and backwards, but routinely taking a big step in. And this is the final, and there were some really good matches for Kieran in getting to the final. So fighting Neil Ernest and I think Igor Maximenko as well. In terms of getting to the final. So why do you think he was able to get away with that big step?
I actually think that the distance is so long here that when he makes that big step, people think, oh, I can come through it, just like here. And then because his foot position is so precise and it's actually between himself and the opponent, he's able to extend and use that. And I think Kieran actually used it very well to get the hands himself as well.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that the distance was just that little bit further out, that people thought, okay, I can actually counter this handy. And then as they came in to close the distance, he had his foot in a good position to maybe get off some of his own sidekicks as well.
Yeah, and I think he uses that rocking motion, that forward to back. He tend to leave the head lean forward, but he'd shift backwards, and then rather than bouncing forward, as the pattern was built, he'd shift backwards and then step to go forward. So I think he was quite good at getting people to fall into that pattern of here I go, back forward, and then he'd change it up. And I think we saw some very similar things here actually from Neil Ernest. It was very, very much able to make a step work for him, but a much shorter and choppier step from him.
Yeah, and I think two of these guys in particular, David Kerr and Neil Ernest, they were kind of a little bit more of the modern style in this time of around 2003. But it's interesting to note as well that Neil is still kind of in a half-facing stance, as you can see, and he still gets off his side kick really, really well. So that's actually a difficult thing to do, and it's rare enough that you can see somebody being able to use their front leg side kick from that position.
I think the step, the preparatory step is quite key to that for him, because it lets him drift from this half-facing stance to, once he brings his back foot in that little bit and changes the angle of the back foot to point the toes backwards, it does let him carry really far. And when we talk about carrying, we can use examples from Neil again. But let's jump up the years a little bit and have a look at the stance that's being used now by Adam Shelley. He's in, well, they're both in red. So Adam's in the
official red corner.
The official red corner, but towards the centre of the ring at the moment.
Yeah, so you can see, like, we kind of call this like almost like a jousting side kick, where he's trying to use his kick at full length, and he's coming from that longer stance for sure. And obviously, I think one of the big takeaways is to use your kind of natural strengths. Obviously, Adam is quite tall and rangy, and he uses that to his advantage. Obviously, Adam is somebody who was very, very dominant with hands as well, so he needed to adjust that stance when he wanted to go to hands. But obviously, his intent here is to set out his stall at the start of the round with a very strong and long side kick.
Yeah, and even his preparatory steps, those little shifts, given the length of his stance, the step is very small. If he was a smaller guy and a small, with that length of a stance, it would look like a huge step. But because, he's got that length and that ranginess to him, it does make it quite different. And that little short step doesn't do too much. It's very easy to hide. And I think that lets him be very effective with it.
Distance with it, though,
Massive.
doesn't he? Because of that little bit.
Yeah.
Like, it's not much of a step, and you wouldn't notice it much. But the reason we generally tell people not to step when they're coming through the ranks is because you can easily be countered. But he doesn't leave that gap to Luke to close the distance then either. And Luke tries it once, but because he has so much range and because that stance is so long, he still gets away with it.
Absolutely. And the one thing is, you can tell your students all you want, don't step. They'll still make a step like this most of the time. Like, it's very, very rare that their back foot won't budge. So, it's more kind of, I suppose, cueing the intent not to make a big, obvious step, rather than saying, look, do not move your back foot under any circumstances.
Yeah.
You were saying before we came on that, like, really one of the few people that you'd see almost makes no body movement or head movement as he picks his leg up. So quite an exceptional side kick in this case.
Yeah, you can see here on this one, like, there's literally no shift of the upper body, and that's very rare because it's a tell and it's a cue to your opponent what's coming. And Dylan was able to just lift the heel, and the heel, you can see the heel is right away up in the position for him to directly attack, and it was very, very unique. And like, I think the hip flexibility and the hip mobility you need for that is crazy, and it's not something that everybody can do. But as a result, it's a very short and tidy kick to his body, so he has the ability then to extend the range or have it very tight and close if needs be. So it's a very unique one and a massive weapon for him.
So a few little kind of takeaways. There are lots of ways that you could deliver your side kick, but it will depend on your stance. So how you set yourself up from the floor will influence which side kick you choose and how exactly you deliver it. So maybe if we go from there and we'll look at the idea of carrying it forward in multiples or carrying it forward as a single shot, and how that impacts your shot selection. So we're starting here with a little bit of a clip from Julia Cross, where I would say she kind of had that signature Willie Van Immortal style low knee side kick. So the heel comes up first, or the kicking tool comes up first between her and her opponent, and then the knee kind of arrives up to drive it through.
Yeah, and I think that was a big focus maybe in this particular era, because I trained a few times with Julia, and she mentions this of having that really strong kick, and I know her student Giles is the same. Like, their intent is to pull that knee back to the chest, where we see a couple of clips from the present day. It's more about just getting the foot on the target. It's not about that strength and that power behind the kick as much, where I think back then the intent was to hit strong and hard, whereas maybe now it's a bit more focused towards getting the point and getting an effective score.
For sure. I mean, speaking of hitting strong and hitting hard, you know, he was certainly a fan of it, and with Thomas Barada here. But we're still looking at singles. But this, with the, you know, the ones that we've picked out here, have that pump action to it. So there's the lift, jump in the back foot, and then pump through. So very much still a single shot, but the body is being carried with it.
True. Yeah, and I think the intent of, like what we were saying earlier, are you hitting the one shot to be nice and strong, or are you looking to carry? Usually when you carry, you're looking to close the distance.
Yeah.
So I bit of a hypothesis maybe, but maybe the earlier days, people were using their psychic to actually hit and score, and hit strong, like we said, as opposed to close the distance, and maybe kind of almost, in the modern day, they will use their front leg to fence and almost play and see what happens. If the distance is closed, maybe I can go with the hands. If the distance isn't there, maybe I can use my kick and adjust to the high section or whatever. So I think the intent was a little bit different. People use their psychic to actually hit and score with that psychic, as opposed to now it's almost like a feeler to see what comes next, because I can close the distance.
And I think a huge factor of that was just how much, once you put the scoreboards there and you see how few sidekicks actually score, I think that changes it a little bit. But we have a more modern take on it here, where you can see that the intent to get through the hip and do damage isn't the same in this particular series of shots there that we have from Vitali, where it's a much longer leg already as it reaches out for the target. That knee back towards the chest action isn't there, but it is very fast, it's direct and linear A to B, and it's explosive.
Yeah, it's almost like a side rising kick with like knee half bent. So as you said, the knee doesn't come back to the chest, and that gives a nice distance on it as well. And I think at the moment in this particular bout he was up, so he's kind of using it to keep, you can see 4-0 there in the corner. So he's kind of using this to keep his opponent at bay. At the same time, like, this type of a side kick is very effective to keep that distance, and it can frustrate your opponent as well, because they're looking to get through that straight line. So it's a very effective one. And as we said, the big key is that it was kind of used almost like a jab in boxing. So it's a boxer's jab essentially, but with the front leg. But back in the day, it was kind of used more as a big shot.
And I mean, there's still perfectly good examples now. You have, you know, it depends on your philosophy. What do you want your sidekick to do? And I mean, we've often pointed out with Julio, like, he really kicks to kick with his sidekick. It's not a fencing movement for the most part. It is definitely looking to create space to cause, you know, a little bit of trauma and move the person. So, you know, we do see examples of each, the kind of what we might be labeling a little bit for this video, older school stuff. We're definitely seeing that, you know, with cutting edge, you know, very topical fighters at the moment, and they're still using these techniques. It's never saying that what was old doesn't work anymore. It's a case of things cycle through in trends, and it's important to understand, well, why do they do that? Let's have a look at some of the carrying. So this is looking to bring yourself forward with multiples, and here we have Simone Olivia from Italy looking to carry forward and, you know, make multiple use of the side kick.
Yeah, and I think you made a great point earlier about the scoreboards, and obviously now one of the big kind of factors excuse me, of using that carry is to close the distance and use your ring space to your advantage. And obviously now with the scoreboards, we know how important warnings are and exits. So obviously that is another, almost like an additional benefit of being able to carry and close the distance. For
sure. And then we have this kind of like, that there are different ways that you can do it. So I mean, we go back here and we can see a step and lift. So Simone was very much looking to lift and then push, where, you know, we can also do it with this little step in first to shorten it, because it's going to be much easier to lift up that leg and carry forward once you've shortened that stance. And if you go back to our conversation with Dominic some time ago, we might have to link that video. We can look at how important it is to get that front knee high if you're going to carry forward with some explosiveness, and shortening your stance slightly can really help with that. And we've had some clips with Neil where he really does just explode across the ring once he gets that knee up.
Yeah, and I think that knee position is an important factor with the carry as well, because we'll see, like, even particularly with the female divisions in the lighter weights these days, they'll pull that knee really high up towards their own head, and then it's almost like it is a side kick, but it can also be changed into anything you like. It's like a hybrid chamber. So they can come over with the axe, they can go turning kick, hook kick, whatever they like from there. So I think that was a big difference as well, where this is a side kick to the body. Like, you see Neil, he can transfer that to the head if he needs to.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, the side kick was used as the longest distance possible to the hip, which is the longest distance. The higher you go, the shorter the distance will be from you to your opponent. So I think that is a factor as well of that side kick. It was intent was to go to the body, and if you can close the distance with it, well and good. Let's get the hands as well.
And then what if you need, if your carry isn't as good, you can kind of hybridize it by using a springboard effect. So we'll see it here with Jack Otterston and Julio, where the foot drops, but the drop is used to almost power the next movement.
Yeah, because it's almost like the springboard of a gymnastics arena, so you can use that to gain momentum and spring you forward, and it's a lovely shot, and it can be worked really, really well.
And it is an interesting one, isn't it, for just to have that alternative, that if you're not going to hop and carry your way across the ring or whatever, it lets you do some different things that maybe that carry doesn't. So letting the leg drop in different rhythms lets you set and break rhythms. Yeah, and you can also...
It's a different rhythm.
Yeah, because when you lift your leg and you carry forward, you're setting kind of a constant speed for yourself as you go forward that your opponent can read. Whereas when the leg drops and comes up again, it can drop and come up with a faster shift. It can drop and come up with a shorter kick. So because you can change the length and the height of each kick every time the leg drops, it does give you a very interesting rhythm advantage, I think.
And the trajectory. Maybe it's going to float up like that heel we've seen, or maybe they're going to swoop up into a hook kick or something. So it's very, very unpredictable. So that's why it's effective, I feel. But Julio uses it really well because he uses that linked with the pump action one that we've seen earlier. So he has that lovely mix. So it's very hard to read it and to be able to counter it with your hands, or whether you want to close the distance or whatever. So
the range
it is
always
very, very
different.
effective.
So let's flip it all on its head and we'll go defensively. So as we're looking at the what comes next is what about the side kick on the back end, and we step back a little bit, and this is I think Tomasz Borko from Slovenia against Igor Maximenko, and here in the first effort it's not too successful, but the big thing that we can see from this is there's no attempt to move the body or to adjust his distance relative to Igor in this one. And even in this one with Neil, where it is successful, there's the moving the body comes after the kick is connected, and that's very different from what we see now, isn't it?
Yeah, I think as well on these two in particular, it's almost as a reaction shot, whereas now people will set up the defensive side kick by being a step ahead. They will almost put in their upper body, suck the opponent in, invite it in exactly, and it'll be there. But that retreating step is vital. You see here Ryan is going backwards. And why does he have to go backwards? Because as the space comes in from the attacker, if you stay there is no space for the kick.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're coming forward, you have to almost match that step back to create the same space for you to get off the kick. Obviously, kicks are longer than hands, so you need a bit more space to get to the defensive side. And this one is really tidy from Dylan. He pulls it really, really close to the chest.
Absolutely. And that's just giving you kind of a few kind of concepts in terms of what might be on your mind when it comes to playing or practicing your defensive side kick, that yes, it can be done as a stop side kick, but you will probably have to set it up, so you'll have to force your opponent to come from a longer range, by force them into backward motion or whatever it is, but most of the time you're inviting the person on and having to give ground in order to preserve the distance between you and your opponent and let the kick develop. And the first example we had from Thomas there, where it didn't quite work, as you said, it was that reaction. He was kind of caught standing still as Igor came forward, and it didn't quite fit. So that brings us into... Oh, sorry, go for it.
Just before we move on, there's a little bit of an influence from Wacko point fighting as well, I think, with that.
For sure.
Almost knee down. It's like a back kick without the spin. So it's where the knee down, heel up defensive side kick. Now, the only thing with that is it's much shorter. And for us, with 4 referees in ITF, there's a chance that maybe the person attacking with hands will get the better return based on the referees, as opposed to Wacko point fighting, where the system is a little bit different. But it can be still a very effective shot if you get it. And it can be quite a strong shot, taking the wind out of your opponent if you time it correctly. Yeah,
really, really good call. So looking at the maybe the last style of putting the side kick in there before we look at what happens after it gets there, we look at the floaters. So we kind of had the the idea that, and it's a little bit like the image in the background there, that sometimes the leg is picked up and then it's a wait and see what develops.
Yeah, because I think that these flexi fighters have the luxury of seeing what happens, because they can adjust that kick quite seamlessly. So whether they want to close the distance, or whether they want to shoot to the head, or whether they're going to get the hands after this, they have the option, and they have the luxury to kind of wait and see, which means they're not using their first and second shot as big heavy hits. So we almost call it like flicking rather than kicking. So there's a time for each, and you got to kind of know when is the moment to use each type.
And of course, they don't always finish the side kicks, as you mentioned earlier. So the goal here is, it starts in that kind of versatile chamber. It probably will be a side kick if it develops that way. But if the person moves back, if the person like drops their front hand, it can change to a turning kick, a hook kick, or a hacks very, very easily.
Yeah, waiting for them to make a mistake, basically. But I think one of the factors with this, again, maybe it's because of the scoreboards nowadays, is it's used as almost like a pressure reliever as well. So if the space is put on and you feel there's a squeeze on you, that people can use this to almost just regain space and take a little bit more control of the distance and the ring position.
And I think we can see this a little bit with Sylvia here, where the leg is often coming up without any intent to go forwards or backwards. It is kind of kicking into the space to see what develops as well. So it neutralizes the other person coming forward a little bit, but she can very quickly transition it and go body to head or push forward a little bit. So that kind of floating it out there and waiting and being patient enough to see what happens it's a different skill, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And for me, this is the biggest difference between the old school and new school. That we didn't really see this type of kick in the we say 80s, 90s, 2000s, in the early days. There was maybe one or two who used it like this, but generally this is much more common now. I feel keeping the front leg light and just kind of playing with that front leg. And it wasn't the kick, direct single shots are there still, but they're less common.
So that all plays into the how do we use the side kick and what is the goal. And we talked about how sometimes the goal of the side kick is actually to score, but especially now after seeing the scoreboards and seeing how how many side kicks you might have to throw before one scores, very often they're used to carry into contact, and that's not new. That's not something that's an artifact of the new era. This has been going on for ages, and if we look at the engagement that the side kick brings you to, have a couple of examples that go back a little bit further, but you can see a couple of different carries of the side kick here as well. And this is Kreisha Lopez against Julia Cross, but Kreisha carries very much like a 45-degree chamber, where it can quickly become a side kick to the hip, but it can also just float her into contact and bring her hands into play.
Yeah, because of that angle, when she drops her foot, of course, she's going to be ready to punch correctly. Like you can see here, she's not stuck side facing. There, actually, you've seen that hybrid side kick from Julia, actually, the defensive one, where on the exit there, it's not really a back kick, but it is a back kick at the same time. So
exactly,
she's kind of dropping that shoulder. So that's one we mentioned earlier as well.
But I think you do definitely see that as an option. And here we have from Dariusz Jankowski from Poland, multiple times world champion, and his side kick, it's a little bit of a side turning kick sometimes. It's but it's not really designed to do any damage most of the time. But it brings him into a range where he's very effective. So he's mixing his hands and his turning kicks very, very effectively an awful lot of the time. And what it does is the side kick just gets him into a range safely where he can use it. So he's happy to use it to clash. He's happy to use it just to neutralize the front leg of the other person and bring him into that contact range, in the dominant position.
Yeah, and like we mentioned with Adam earlier, obviously Dariusz was one of the taller guys in his division, so he was using that to full maximum advantage for him, for his own body type as well, I think. So that was a very clever decision from him when he was competing in this plus 80 division, because 80 kilos is probably not the tallest guys in the world usually. So the 85 division that we have now, you might see guys a little bit taller, so he definitely had a big advantage there.
And then finally, we just want to pull in this clip again with Tomasz Borko and Igor Maximenko, and you can see kind of the battle of it, where Thomas is looking to put Igor on the end of his side kick, and use a good psychic connection to set everything up. Where Igor wants all of the angles. He wants to find those ranges where he's just inside, just outside, in order to let him play with the shots that he likes, which are the continuous shots, the flowing shots, going from turning kick to reverse turning kick to back kick, bringing in the hands. And, you know, when it works for the side kick, you can see it's super effective in maintaining that range or that engagement range. But when it doesn't, and the distance is wrong, and you're inside that engagement range, the side kick is no longer effective, you know, and we can see Igor really, really go to work then.
Yeah, the side kick is only effective at the end of the foot. So if you keep your opponent at the end of the kick, it's effective. But once they bypass that foot, or basically once you can put them at the end of the foot and lead into hands yourself, then that's where the extra bits will occur and the extra action as such.
There we go. So we've talked about, you know, the side kick in terms of your stance, how you carry it into action, whether it's singles or multiple kicks. We've talked about the potential to float the kick out there and kind of wait and see what develops. We've looked at maybe that engagement range of, you know, whether you're keeping your opponent at the end of the foot or you're trying to use that kick just to bring you into contact with hands or with turning kicks or with whatever else follows. We've also looked at it going the other direction of taking your side kick to keep you safe and, you know, and score some points on the way back. And I think there's really common themes throughout the years, but the big thing that changes is the intent of the kick. What's the kick for? And I think if, you know, in watching the clips from you know, different stages, the biggest thing that develops in my mind is, am I trying to score with this kick or create physical movement in my opponent, or am I trying to get them to respect the threat of the kick, you know, or its ability to change into a headshot or a scoring kick and control the space that way? So what about you, Richie? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I have to agree, 100%. I think the stance changes is a factor of this as well. The more side facing, not the length of your actual stance now, but the side facing versus the more half facing that we would have seen previously as a common stance. The body positioning more so than the stance maybe. I think that was a big factor. But I think coming into this, I almost thought that there would be a big difference. But looking at the clips now, maybe the differences are very subtle. I think it's what you said, the intent is a big thing. And other than that, there's not any crazy differences, because it really is personal preference in a way as well, because many fighters do it different ways. So I think different fighters find their own way to use their own front leg and side kick effectively. So yeah, I think if you can spot anything that you feel is different, drop it in the comments. Let us know what's your thoughts. Is there a difference, first of all, and what are those differences? Of course, we've covered a lot of different topics now of the side kick, so maybe you can address some of those and share your own experience in the comments.
And even if you just have a side kick fighter or someone that you felt has a particularly good or particularly dangerous side kick, let us know, and maybe we can have a look over some of their clips, some of their fights in a future Fight Chat Friday episode. So other than that, folks, I guess thank you very much, and we'll see you next Friday.
We'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.